Om Namah Shivaya. We'll start this evening with verse 48 of chapter 10. This yoga is only the self. All this world is pervaded by the self. All that exists is of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Shiva is the self, the same as Brahman. The self is entirely Brahman, not just partially so. And Brahman is entirely the self, and not just partially so. That Brahman, this Shiva, is of the nature of absolute existence. It is not differentiated into individuality or I and objective things, all of this. What exists is only this absolute existence itself. Find this to be the nature of the self by profound inquiry. Who am I? He said, this yoga is only the self. Yoga means union, or the means to such. Which yoga is only the self? Well, all yoga, but especially so is it with the yoga of knowledge, self-knowledge. It is only the self that manifests as the inquiry. It is only the self, that absolute existence, that is the substance of the consciousness of the knowledge. The self, that is the knowledge that is innate to the self, is the end and the means to the end. Because of this undivided, seamless nature, it is always fruitful. All this world is pervaded by the self. It is pervaded to such an extent that there is no distinction at all between the pervader and the pervaded. That is, the pervaded exists only as the self and has no existence apart from this. What is all this world? Jagat. the universe. Just that very existence. Nowhere is existence not. It is all pervasive. It pervades I, it pervades this. If all this world is entirely pervaded by the self of the nature of absolute being consciousness, can we really say there is a world? All that exists is of the self. There is nothing apart. There is nothing other. There is only the self. The self, yourself, which is not individualized or particularized. Evidently, it must be bodiless or it would not be all pervasive. All that exists is of the self. So what is the self? One who knows the self as the self knows reality. He knows the nature of all that is. Nothing exists besides the self, the verse concludes. Nothing exists besides the self. All that was thought to be other is not so. Nothing exists besides the self because the self is existence. Can there be anything apart from existence? By this yoga of self-knowledge, determine the nature of the self within. And if you find absolute existence, then there is nothing beside you, nothing apart from you, nothing different. All that exists is of the self. Verse 49. Consider all as of the nature of the self. The Guru is entirely of the nature of the self. The shishya is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. How should it be experienced by you? As knowledge. So he says, consider all, that is, know all, as of the nature of the self. With fine discrimination, attain this discerning knowledge of what in truth you are. Consider all as of the nature of the self. Well, if you do so consider, what does that mean for your experience? Only that alone is. And nothing exists besides the self. The Guru is entirely of the nature of the self. That means he is entirely and eternally transcendent. He is not limited to the form that the five senses perceive. He cannot be defined by the mind. His wisdom and his grace are of the nature of himself. And the nature of himself is the nature of the self. The self itself shines as the Guru. The Guru is the self manifested. and the nature of that manifestation and the power by which it manifests are all the same self. He never swerves from his abidance as the self, because his abidance is the eternal knowledge, the permanent existence. The shishya, the disciple, also is entirely of the nature of the self. By the upadesha, or spiritual instruction, and the grace of the guru, the shishya, or disciple, realizes the fact of what his true nature is. And when he finds it, it is that very same self. So then, although it is not explicitly stated in the verse, we can understand that the substance of the instruction, the means of conveying the knowledge from the guru to the disciple, is also of the very same nature of the self. So there is the self, the self, the self. Nothing exists besides the self. It is the truth, the simple truth, that nothing exists besides the self. And we remain ever devoted to the Guru who shows us this. Verse 50. A God is entirely of the nature of the self. The fruits are entirely of the nature of the self. All goals are of the nature of the self. Nothing else, nothing exists besides the self. When a God is worshipped, God in any form, what is the nature of that God? That God has no existence apart from the existence. And the fruits of worship of that God are entirely of the nature of the self. Continuing in the same way, he says all goals. This is best understood in a spiritual context, of course, not worldly goals. But all goals are of the nature of the self. Even with a worldly goal, one is attempting to find the self. It's just not a very efficient way of doing so. The spiritual goal to be reached is not apart from you, but is of the nature of the self. What you worship, in truth, is only of the nature of the self. A God apart from existence would be a non-existent God, which would be absurd. That God which is only existence is none other than the self. Verse 51. Holy waters are all of the nature of the self. Oneself is entirely of the nature of the self. Liberation is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Holy waters are said to be purifying. From where does their power derive? From something that can never be impure. One should regularly immerse himself in the waters of the knowledge of the self, to be free of the impurities of ignorance. Oneself is entirely of the nature of the self. The absolute existence, or the self, is your real identity. There is nothing else constituting oneself. The assumption that you are different from the self, that you are a separate individuality, is illusion, made of imagination. The imagination also It's not apart from the self. Of course, you can know such only when you've put an end to all ignorance. When you put an end to all ignorance, you're free from every kind of bondage. You find that bondage is unreal, and that what was thought of as a state of liberation until that time is actually the very nature of your being. So he says, liberation is entirely of the nature of the self. Therefore, you are not in quest of some objectified experience that would come and go. You're in quest of your true being. Being is not a product of anything. It is not a transformation or a modification of something. It is not an attainment or something to be obtained. It never becomes impure. This, your real nature, is what the inquiry is for. Liberation, then, turns out not to be a state, and all bondage turns out to be unreal. Samsara turns out to be entirely illusory. And what you strive in earnestness to realize exists as your very being, always. Nothing exists besides the self. Verse 52. Desire is entirely of the nature of the self. Action is entirely of the nature of the self. Anger is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Even ignorance in its various forms does not stand up separate from the self. It doesn't have its own existence. Only the absolute existence, not understood, misperceived, appears as all this. From ignorance arises desire, because having lost track of one's real being, one has lost track of the innate happiness. Thus desire arises. From kama or desire comes krodha, anger or frustration, because it's inherent in extroversion to not find what you're looking for, the perpetual happiness of real being. Action and feeling that you are the performer of action also has no separate existence. All that exists is only of the nature of the self. Of course, if you realize such as the truth, will you have desire, karma, or anger? Can we lose ignorance yet still retain the illusory manifestations of such? And you see nothing exists besides the self. What would you desire? Over what would you become angry? Who would be engaged in such? All that is there the entire time is that one absolute existence. And that is your real identity. Om Namah Shivaya.